A black belt jokingly asked a black cleaner to fight, and what happened next left the entire martial arts gym silent. "Hey, you! The cleaning guy! How about a quick demonstration?" shouted Derek from the center of the mat, his black belt shining under the gym's fluorescent lights. "I bet you've never seen a real fight in your life, have you?" James Washington stopped mopping the floor and slowly looked up. At 42, he had only been working as a cleaner at this gym for 3 weeks, always arriving after hours once the students had left. But that Thursday night, the advanced group's training had run later than usual. "I don't want to disturb you, Sensei," James replied calmly, returning to scrubbing a stubborn stain on the floor. "I'm just finishing up here so you can continue." Derek let out a theatrical laugh that echoed through the gym. "Look, guys, this guy is even afraid to step on the mat." The 8 students present laughed nervously, some clearly uncomfortable with the situation. What Derek didn't know was that James had spent the last 20 years trying to completely forget who he really was. 20 years since he left the ring after an accident that changed his life forever. 20 years of guarding a secret that not even his teenage daughter knew. "Come on, man," Derek continued, approaching with that arrogant smirk he used to intimidate beginners. "Just a little demonstration. I bet you don't even know a basic guard. How about you show my students the difference between someone who trains and someone who just cleans?" James felt that familiar sensation in his chest, like a dormant muscle waking up after years of inactivity. His eyes briefly met Derek's. For a split second, something passed between them that made the instructor take an involuntary step back. "Just an educational demonstration," Derek insisted, now trying to hide the sudden uncertainty in his voice. "Nothing serious, just to show the beginners why it's important to respect martial arts." James left the bucket on the floor and stood up slowly. His movements had a strange fluidity for someone who had supposedly never stepped on a mat. Around the gym, the students stopped training, realizing something was happening. "All right," James said finally, his voice as calm as the surface of a lake before a storm. "But when we're done, you're going to apologize to all of them for turning the mat into a circus." Derek laughed, but this time the sound was a bit forced. "Apologize, man. You'll be the one apologizing to the floor when you meet it." What none of them knew was that James Washington had been James Silent Storm Washington, a 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. He had retired at the peak of his career after an accident that cost the life of his best friend and training partner. He had since sworn never to fight again, but some promises are made to be broken when dignity is at stake. If you like this story of overcoming and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple moment of prejudice would become the most humiliating lesson of Derek's life. Derek adjusted his black belt with a theatrical gesture, clearly savoring every second of attention. "Guys, gather round. You're about to see a practical demonstration of why hierarchy exists in the martial arts world." James watched the 8 students form a semicircle around the mat. Some seemed eager for the demonstration, others visibly uncomfortable. A young Asian woman with her hair pulled back whispered something to her partner, who just shook his head in disapproval. "Look, guys," Derek continued, gesturing dramatically, "here we have a perfect example of someone who has never understood that there are appropriate places for each type of person. Elite gyms are not for, well, you know." James felt that familiar pang in his chest, the same one he had felt 22 years ago when he heard similar comments about fighters who didn't look like champions. The difference was that now, at 42, he had learned to transform anger into fuel for something much more powerful than punches. "Sensei Derek," the young Asian woman interrupted timidly, "can we continue with our normal training? It's getting late." "Sarah Chen, are you questioning my teaching methodology?" Derek interrupted her sharply. "Sit down and watch. You'll learn more in the next 5 minutes than in a month of conventional training." James noticed how Derek had used the girl's full name, a clear demonstration of authority. He also recognized the look of fear in her eyes, the same one he'd seen in the mirror for 2 decades, when he woke up in a panic, remembering the accident that had taken the life of Tony, the Hammer Rodriguez, his best friend and training partner. Tony had died because of him. It was that simple. A series of blows James executed with excessive force during a training session. Tony fell, hit his head strangely on the ground, and never woke up. The investigation concluded it was an accident, but James knew the truth. He had lost control due to the pressure and the racist comments from the crowd that night. "Well, cleaner," Derek mocked, "how about you show my students how to do a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop?" Laughter echoed through the gym, but James remained motionless. He closed his eyes briefly, and for a moment he was back in that Las Vegas ring, hearing the same comments that preceded the tragedy that changed his life forever. "What's wrong?" "Scared?" Derek insisted, now circling James like a predator. "Or are you just going to stand there like a post, just like you do with that mop all day?" It was then that Derek made his first fatal mistake. He pushed James lightly on the shoulder. A seemingly harmless touch, but one that carried all the arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. James absorbed the push without moving an inch. His feet remained planted on the floor like oak roots, and Derek felt as if he had tried to push a concrete wall. The instructor's arrogant smile faltered for a split second. "Interesting," James muttered, more to himself than to Derek. "It's been a while since anyone tried to provoke me like that." There was something in James's voice that made the atmosphere change. It wasn't a threat or anger. It was the terrifying calm of someone who'd already walked through much darker valleys and come out transformed. Derek, unable to read the danger signs, raised the stakes. "Did you hear that, guys? He thinks it's interesting. How about we teach him the difference between thinking and knowing?" What Derek didn't realize was that every word, every humiliating gesture, was awakening something in James that had lain dormant for 2 decades. It wasn't anger or a thirst for revenge, but something much more dangerous, the crystal-clear memory of who he really was when he stopped hiding. Sarah Chen watched the scene with growing discomfort. There was something in the way the cleaner was breathing, in the way his muscles tensed almost imperceptibly, that reminded her of the documentaries about great predators she watched on the Discovery Channel. The calm before the attack. "Last chance, pal," Derek announced, now clearly irritated by James's lack of reaction. "Either you accept the demonstration like a man, or I'll call security to escort you out. And guess what? You'll lose your job too." James opened his eyes slowly. When his gaze met Derek's, the instructor felt a shiver run down his spine, as if he had just awakened a dragon he thought was only a harmless lizard. "All right," James said finally, his voice low but loaded with an authority that made everyone present fall silent instantly. "But when we're finished, I want you to explain to your students why you've turned a place of learning into a circus of humiliation." Derek laughed, but this time the sound was nervous. "Explain. You'll be the one with a lot of explaining to do when you're on the floor." What none of them knew was that James had spent the last 20 years not just running from his past, but perfecting an emotional control that had transformed his old destructive anger into something much more refined and devastatingly effective. Each new humiliation only fed a silent force within him, a cold determination that his former opponents knew well, but which Derek was about to discover in the worst way possible. Derek adjusted his stance, clearly pleased with the respectful silence that had settled in the gym. His 8 students formed a perfect circle around the mat, some eager for the demonstration, others visibly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding. "Guys, you're about to witness a lesson worth more than 6 months of training," Derek announced theatrically, spreading his arms like a showman. "The difference between those who dedicate their lives to martial arts and those who just, well, clean the floor where real fighters walk." James remained motionless in the center of the mat, but something had changed in his breathing. He closed his eyes briefly, and for a moment he was no longer in this Denver gym. He was back at the National Gymnasium in Las Vegas 22 years ago, hearing identical comments from the audience before his world title fight against Victor the Demolisher Petrov. "Look at that black guy," someone had yelled from the stands that distant night. "I bet he doesn't last 3 rounds against a real fighter." James had won by TKO in the second round, but the victory had cost him dearly. The pressure from the racist comments had made him lose control during the next training session, leading to the accidental death of Tony Rodriguez. "Come on, cleaner," Derek mocked, now circling James like a predator. "How about you show my students how not to do a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop?" It was then that Sarah Chen couldn't take it anymore and intervened. The 22-year-old jiu-jitsu purple belt and master's student in sports psychology had spent the last 2 years documenting cases of discrimination in sports for her thesis. What she was witnessing was valuable academic material, but also deeply disturbing. "Sensei Derek," she interrupted with a firm voice, "may I ask you a question? Why exactly do you feel it's necessary to humiliate someone who is just doing their job?" The silence that followed was cutting. Derek turned slowly towards Sarah, narrowing his eyes with a mix of surprise and irritation. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but who is teaching this class?" "You are," she replied calmly. "But that shouldn't include racial humiliation disguised as a technical demonstration." Several students exchanged nervous glances. No one had ever confronted Derek like that. The instructor felt his face flush with a mix of anger and shame. "Racial?" Derek laughed with effort. "This has nothing to do with race. It has to do with respect for the martial arts and knowing your place." James opened his eyes slowly. There was something in the way Sarah had spoken, in the courage of a young woman standing up to an established authority, that reminded him of his younger sister, Kesa. She too had possessed that same determination, that same refusal to accept injustice in silence. Kesa had died at 17, a victim of a stray bullet during a police confrontation in their neighborhood. James was competing in Japan when he got the news. Another person he loved, lost while he was chasing glory in distant rings. Yet another reason to abandon everything and disappear into the simplicity of an anonymous life. "Sarah," Derek said, his voice dangerously low, "if you can't respect my teaching method, maybe you should find another academy. There are places more suitable for people with your mindset." The threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, but she held her ground. "My payments are up to date, Sensei, and I believe everyone here deserves a learning environment based on mutual respect, not humiliation." It was then that James did something no one expected. He began to smile. It wasn't a nervous or submissive smile. It was the slow, calculated smile of someone who had just found a reason to stop hiding. For 20 years, he had carried the weight of guilt for 2 deaths that had indirectly resulted from his involvement in the fighting world. Now, seeing a brave young woman defending principles of justice that he had abandoned decades ago, James Washington began to remember who he really was. "Derek," James said finally, his voice conveying a quiet authority that made everyone in the room turn to him. "The young lady is right. This isn't about martial arts. This is about you trying to feel important by belittling others." Derek spun around, his face red with indignation. "How dare you give me lessons on martial arts? You don't even know what a dojo is." James took a step forward, and something fundamental changed in his posture. His shoulders aligned, his center of gravity lowered imperceptibly, and his feet settled into a stance that any experienced fighter would instantly recognize as perfect. "Actually," James said calmly, "I know exactly what a dojo is, and I know this place stopped being one a long time ago." Derek felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. There was something in the way James moved now, in the way he occupied space, that awakened all his survival instincts, but his wounded pride wouldn't let him back down. "Enough talk!" Derek snarled, adopting his favorite fighting stance. "I'll teach you respect in the most direct way possible." Sarah watched the scene with growing apprehension, but also with professional fascination. She had documented hundreds of hours of sparring and competition for her research, and something in the way the cleaner moved reminded her of the great masters she had studied in historical videos. The economy of movement, the controlled breathing, the calm presence that radiated contained power. James closed his eyes briefly and let 20 years of muscle memory resurface. Every perfected technique, every victory won, every lesson learned in the world's most brutal rings. When he opened them again, Derek was looking directly into the eyes of Silent Storm Washington, the 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. "Last chance to apologize," James offered kindly. "To her, to your students, and to turn this place back into a space of learning." Derek laughed, but the sound was nervous and forced. "Apologize, man. You'll be begging for forgiveness when you're on the floor." What Derek couldn't see was that James had already identified all his technical weaknesses. The guard held too high, leaving the body exposed. The tendency to retreat with his right leg first. The way he telegraphed his punches with micro-movements of his shoulder. 20 years away from the rings hadn't erased decades of refined technical analysis. Sarah noticed other students beginning to instinctively move away, like wild animals, sensing an impending storm. The energy in the room had completely changed, as if the air had become electrically charged before a lightning strike. It was when everyone laughed at Derek's final taunts that something unexpected began to take shape in James's expression. It wasn't anger or a desire for revenge, but the serene determination of someone who had found a cause worthy of breaking a 20-year oath of silence. Some of those present began to realize that something extraordinary was about to happen. Without fully understanding what their eyes were witnessing, Derek adopted his favorite combat stance, the one he had used to intimidate hundreds of novices over the years. Feet shoulder-width apart, fists at chest height, weight shifted slightly forward. The classic stance of someone who learned martial arts in controlled environments against predictable opponents. James remained motionless for a few seconds, just observing. His eyes scanned Derek from head to toe, automatically cataloging every technical detail. The high guard exposing the ribs, the unstable base compromising his balance, the excessive tension in his shoulders that telegraphed every move before it even began. "Still waiting," Derek taunted, bouncing lightly on his feet. "Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost?" It was then that James did something no one expected. He began to move. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a subtle repositioning of his feet, a slight drop in his center of gravity, his shoulders relaxing into a perfectly horizontal line. But to anyone who knew what to look for, the transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Sarah Chen felt a shiver run down her spine. In 2 years of studying sports biomechanics, she had analyzed hundreds of hours of footage of great fighters. What she had just witnessed was the transition from an ordinary man to a natural predator, a change as subtle as it was devastating. "Interesting," Derek muttered, his confidence wavering for the first time. There was something in the way James occupied space now that awakened all his survival instincts. James took a step forward, and Derek instinctively retreated. The movement was so involuntary, so primitive, that several students noticed, a black belt backing down from a cleaner. The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. "Is there a problem?" James asked softly, a quiet authority in his voice that silenced everyone. Derek felt the blood rush to his cheeks. His reputation was being questioned in front of his own students. He couldn't back down now, even if every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop and apologize. "No problem," Derek replied, forcing a smile. "Just admiring your stance. Did someone teach you that on YouTube?" The joke fell flat. No one laughed. The tension in the room had become almost palpable. "Actually," James said calmly, "I learned it at a place called the National Gymnasium in Las Vegas. Maybe you've heard of it." Derek frowned. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. "Las Vegas? What kind of weekend course did you take there?" Sarah Chen discreetly pulled her phone from her pocket and typed quickly, "National Gymnasium Las Vegas Martial Arts." What she found made her blood run cold. It wasn't just any course. It was where the greatest MMA world champions of the last 3 decades trained. "Derek," James continued, his voice still calm, "last chance. Apologize to Sarah for questioning her right to speak. Apologize to your students for turning this place into a circus. And above all, apologize to yourself for becoming exactly the type of person martial arts should teach you not to be." The offer of mercy hung in the air like smoke. Derek could have chosen humility. He could have acknowledged he had crossed a line, could have preserved what little dignity he had left. Instead, he attacked. Derek's first punch was technically perfect, a direct, fast and precise jab, executed exactly as he had learned in the manuals. It was the kind of punch that worked against 99% of the people he had trained with over the years. James was not in the 99%. The movement was so fast, so fluid, that half of those present couldn't even process what had happened. James simply wasn't where Derek had aimed the punch. His body had slipped to the side, like water flowing around a rock, and suddenly Derek found himself off balance, his arm extended into the void. "Good attempt," James commented softly, "already repositioned and perfectly balanced. Clean technique, adequate speed, but you telegraphed the move with your right shoulder." Derek spun wildly, trying to locate his opponent. How could someone move that fast? "Beginner's luck," he muttered, more to himself than to James. The second attack came in a sequence: jab, cross, hook. 3 punches chained together with the precision of someone who had practiced the combination thousands of times. It was his favorite sequence, the one he used to end training sessions and impress beginners. Once again, James simply wasn't there. This time, Sarah managed to follow the movement. James had ducked slightly, allowing the jab to pass centimeters from his head. The cross met only air as he leaned his torso back in an impossible arc. And as Derek threw the hook with all his strength, James took a small step back, causing the fist to miss his chin by millimeters. "Interesting combination," James observed, his breathing not even quickening. "Works well against people who stand still, but you're leaving your left side completely exposed after the hook." Derek was starting to sweat. This wasn't normal. He had landed thousands of punches in his life, and now he couldn't land a single one on a man who supposedly had never fought. "Stop dancing and fight!" Derek shouted, launching an even more aggressive sequence. It was then that James decided the demonstration had lasted long enough. Derek's third attack, a desperate combination of punches and kicks, again met only air. But this time, something different happened. When Derek recovered after missing every blow, James was inexplicably closer. "How?" Derek whispered, realizing he had completely lost control of the distance. "Derek," James said softly, now just an arm's length away, "do you want to know the difference between someone who learned to fight in gyms and someone who learned in professional rings?" Before Derek could answer, James did something that defied everything those present thought they knew about physics. Without seeming to use any force, without any sudden or aggressive movements, he simply touched Derek on the chest with the palm of his right hand. Derek went flying. He wasn't pushed or knocked down. He was literally projected backward, as if hit by an invisible wave. His feet left the ground. He flew nearly 2 meters through the air and landed flat on his back with an impact that made everyone in the room gasp. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek lay there for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. He felt no pain, only the irresistible force of someone operating on a completely different level than anything he had ever known. "This," Derek muttered, trying to get up, "this is impossible." Sarah Chen had stopped breathing. In 2 years of studying martial arts, she had never witnessed such a controlled and devastating demonstration of power. There was no brutality, no anger, just the clinical application of a technique she had only seen in legends. "Actually," James said calmly, extending a hand to help Derek up, "it's very simple when you understand leverage, timing, and energy transfer. These are principles I learned during my professional career." Derek ignored the outstretched hand and stood up on his own, his legs still trembling. "Professional career? In what?" It was Sarah who answered. Her voice was almost a whisper. "You don't understand who he is, do you?" All eyes turned to her. She was still holding her phone with the search results. On the screen, dozens of articles, photos, and videos confirmed what her instinct had already sensed. "James Washington," she read aloud, "also known as Silent Storm, 5-time world mixed martial arts champion, considered one of the greatest technical fighters in history, retired undefeated after an accident that caused the death of his training partner." The impact of the words hit the room like a bomb. Derek's face went pale as reality crystallized. He had challenged a living legend of martial arts. He had publicly humiliated someone who could have knocked him out with a casual movement. Five-time world champion, Derek stammered, all his arrogance instantly evaporating. James nodded silently. "I retired 20 years ago. Since then I work wherever I can find it. Cleaning, maintenance, simple jobs, a simple life. No spotlights, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone." Derek's transformation was instant and painful to watch. The arrogant man had vanished, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of his ignorance. I didn't know," Derek whispered. "If you had known, you would have treated me with respect," James interrupted kindly. "But you still would have humiliated any other cleaner, any other worker who didn't have titles to defend themselves." The question hurt more than any physical blow. Derek realized that James had put his finger on the heart of his real problem. It wasn't his ignorance of James's credentials, but the fundamental arrogance that made him believe he could humiliate people based on their jobs. Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm. "Sensei Derek, for 2 years I have trained in this gym respecting your experience, but what I witnessed today was not teaching. It was harassment, disguised as instruction." Other students began to murmur in agreement. The revelation about James had completely changed everyone's perspective on what they had witnessed. "James," Derek said finally, with a humility no one there had ever heard from him, "I sincerely apologize. To you, to Sarah, to everyone here, I have no excuse for my behavior." James nodded, accepting the apology with the same elegance with which he had dominated the physical confrontation. "I appreciate that, Derek, but an apology is only the first step. The question is, what are you going to do differently from now on?" Derek looked around, seeing his students with new eyes. Some looked disappointed in his behavior. Others were clearly re-evaluating everything they thought they knew about respect and hierarchy. "I'm going to change," Derek promised. "It will take time, but I'm going to change." It was then that Sarah asked a question that surprised everyone. "Mr. Washington, would you consider teaching again? Because I think we could all learn a lot more from someone who understands that true strength comes with responsibility." James smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all night. "Perhaps, but not to teach fighting techniques, to teach something much more important. That respect isn't earned with belts or titles, but with character." As Derek fully absorbed the most humiliating lesson of his life, a question hung in the air. Would one night of humility be enough to transform decades of arrogance? Or would an even deeper change be needed for true justice to be served? 3 months later, the gym had completely changed. James Washington was no longer just the cleaner. Sarah Chen had convinced the gym owner to hire him as a special instructor for advanced techniques and martial philosophy. Derek lost half of his students in the first week after the incident. The video, discreetly recorded by Sarah, spread across social media, showing a black belt being humiliated by a simple cleaner. His reputation in the martial community was ruined. "Sensei James," Sarah said after a class on respect and humility, "thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be displayed to be recognized." James smiled as he put away the equipment. "The best lesson I can give is simple. Never judge someone by their profession or their appearance. We all have stories that can surprise you." Derek continued to teach at a smaller gym, but now with a humility forced by public shame. He had learned the hard way that arrogance has a price. Sometimes justice arrives silently, like a storm that transforms everything without making a sound. James proved that true revenge is not destroying your opponent, but demonstrating that greatness comes from character, not from titles. If this story has moved you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people transform humiliation into triumph.